I am Maya, 32 years old, and until last Friday, I still held on to the foolish hope that my family could love me for who I am. I had just flown halfway across the world from a classified Navy deployment to attend my sister's rehearsal dinner in Atlanta. I walked in wearing my service dress uniform, exhausted but proud. My father took one look at me, dragged me into a hallway, and sent a text from 2 feet away that shattered my heart completely. I simply smiled, turned on my heel, and prepared to ruin their perfect high society weekend. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the elite circles of Atlanta meant that appearances were not just important, they were everything. Our family was royalty in this specific world of mega churches, exclusive country clubs, and political galas. My mother is a powerful judge, a woman whose gavel strikes fear into the courtroom and whose perfectly manicured hand rules our family with an iron grip. My father, Deacon Harrison, is a pillar of moral authority to his congregation, but a tyrant who measures love in social currency at home. Then there is my older sister, Nia. Nia is a newly minted senior partner at a prestigious law firm, the Golden Child, and the flawless embodiment of everything my parents value. She is currently marrying into an equally prominent political family to cement our dynasty, an event my parents have treated like a royal coronation. I arrived at the grand ballroom of the Buckhead estate straight from the airport. My flight from an overseas naval base had been delayed 3 times, leaving me zero time to change. I stepped into the venue wearing my Navy service dress uniform, the crisp white fabric and shiny brass buttons feeling heavy against my exhausted frame. The medals on my chest represented years of sacrifice, grueling training, and honorable service to my country. Yet as I crossed the threshold, I felt completely out of place. The room was dripping in generational wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over tables draped in imported silk. Waiters in pristine tuxedos circulated with silver trays of champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. Women in designer evening gowns and men in bespoke suits mingled their laughter, ringing out in confident, wealthy tones. I had not even made it to the bar to grab a glass of water when a heavy hand clamped down on my bicep. It was my father. His fingers dug into my arm as he yanked me away from the sparkling ballroom and shoved me into a dimly lit service hallway. I expected a harsh whisper or a demanding lecture about punctuality. I expected him to berate me for missing the cocktail hour or for dragging my military duffel bag into the coat check. Instead, he pulled out his phone. We were standing barely 2 feet apart in the quiet, narrow corridor, but he refused to even speak to me out loud. He was terrified that a passing waiter or distant guest might hear his venom and ruin his pristine image as the loving patriarch. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and read the message that would forever alter the trajectory of my life. The screen glared with his words. "No one cares about your Navy career. Go change into a dress or sit in the back. You look like a man." I stared at the bright screen, the letters blurring together as a familiar suffocating weight settled in my chest. All the years of rigorous military training, the sacrifices, the classified missions that kept me awake for days, reduced to a source of public embarrassment simply because I was not wearing chiffon and pearls. This was the exact same look of pure disgust he gave me 10 years ago when I told him I was enlisting instead of going to law school. While Nia was pledging a top sorority and attending high society cotillions, I was running obstacle courses and learning to lead under fire. Back then, my mother had simply turned her back on me and told her elite friends that I was taking a gap year to find myself. They had always treated my military career like a dirty little secret, a rebellious phase that ruined their perfect family portrait. I looked up from the screen to meet his eyes. My father stood there in his custom Italian suit, his jaw tight, his posture rigid. He was scanning me up and down like a piece of garbage that had blown in from the street, waiting for me to bow my head and apologize for existing outside of his rigid expectations. He expected me to retreat to the nearest restroom in shame. He wanted me to hide in the shadows, so I would not cast a blemish on Nia's flawless wedding weekend. This was the dynamic we had always played out. Nia shined in the spotlight, and I was swept under the rug. Whenever Nia won a high-profile case, my parents threw a lavish dinner party. When I was promoted to a commanding rank, they sent a generic greeting card signed by their assistant. My physical exhaustion from 30 hours of travel suddenly gave way to a rushing adrenaline. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel small, examining the contempt etched into the lines of his face. He truly believed he held all the power. He truly believed that sending me to the back of the room would put me in my place. But as I stood in that hallway, something fundamental snapped inside me. The girl who used to shrink under his judgmental stare, the daughter who craved a single word of validation from a family incapable of giving it, had died somewhere over the Pacific Ocean. I felt my lungs expand, drawing in a deep, steadying breath. I locked my phone, slipped it back into my pocket, and stood at attention. The crisp white fabric of my uniform suddenly felt like a suit of armor protecting me from his toxic expectations. I did not cry. I did not argue. I simply smiled at him. I was no longer the forgotten scapegoat begging for a seat at their table. I was a woman holding a hand of cards they could not possibly comprehend, and I was finally ready to play the game on my own terms. I left my father standing in that dimly lit hallway, his phone still tightly gripped in his hand, and made my way toward the bridal suite. With every step I took away from him, the invisible chains of childhood submission fell away. The heavy oak double doors of the bridal preparation room loomed ahead of me. I pushed them open, stepping from the quiet corridor into an absolute hurricane of manufactured perfection. The air inside the suite was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive hairspray, blooming white roses, and freshly poured mimosas. 7 bridesmaids fluttered around the massive space like nervous birds, all wearing matching blush-pink silk robes and holding crystal champagne flutes. In the center of the room sat my sister Chloe, surrounded by a ring of bright lights, and makeup artists, carefully applying finishing powder to her flawless cheekbones. Standing directly behind her was my mother Brenda. She was meticulously adjusting the delicate lace train of a custom designer gown, her face set in an expression of intense and critical focus. The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind me, the bright chatter in the room instantly died. 7 pairs of manicured bridesmaids stopped mid-laugh, their champagne flutes suspended in the air. The makeup artist paused with her brush hovering over Chloe. Brenda looked up from the lace. Her perfectly lifted features immediately contorted into the exact same expression of visceral distaste my father had just worn in the hallway. She did not see a decorated military officer. She saw a stain on her perfect aesthetic. Brenda let out a long, theatrical sigh, making sure every woman in the room was watching her play the long, suffering matriarch. She dropped the lace and turned fully toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Why cannot you just be elegant like your sister for one single evening?" Brenda said, her voice dripping with that syrupy toxic concern she always used to mask pure poison. "I explicitly told you the dress code for this weekend, yet here you are marching in wearing that rigid uniform, deliberately trying to steal focus." She crossed her arms, looking me up and down with exaggerated disappointment, playing directly to the audience of wide-eyed bridesmaids. "You have been acting out and trying to prove something ever since you lost your college scholarship. It is exhausting, Maya. We just want a peaceful, normal weekend for your sister." I stood perfectly still, letting her words hang in the heavy air of the bridal suite. 10 years ago, that comment would have sent me running to the nearest bathroom to hide my tears. 10 years ago, I would have crumbled under the weight of her manipulation. For a decade, Brenda and my father had spun a carefully crafted narrative to their country club friends and our extended family. They told everyone who would listen that I was the academic failure, the rebellious middle child who blew a full ride to a prestigious university because I could not handle the pressure forcing me to resort to enlisting in the military as a last-ditch effort to straighten out my life. The reality was a deeply buried family secret that they had fiercely guarded to protect their precious golden child. I remembered the screaming matches behind closed doors when Chloe had partied her way through her freshman year at her elite private university. I remembered my father pacing the living room panicked because his business investments had taken a massive hit and they simply did not have the liquid cash to cover Chloe's out-of-state tuition for the next semester. They were terrified of the social embarrassment if their perfect daughter had to drop out and move back home. So I made the sacrifice. I quietly turned down the prestigious academic scholarship I had worked my entire adolescence to earn. I enlisted in the Navy and signed over my enlistment bonuses and a massive portion of my early paychecks directly to my parents so they could quietly cover Chloe's tuition and keep her enrolled. I gave up my dream so Chloe could keep living hers, and in return, my family rewrote history to brand me as the failure to protect her reputation. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked around the room at the bridesmaids who were holding their breath, their eyes darting between me and the bride hungry for the drama. I decided it was finally time to give them exactly what they wanted. I weaponized the truth. I took a slow, measured step into the center of the room. I kept my posture rigidly straight, projecting the absolute authority I had earned, commanding sailors under extreme pressure. I locked eyes with my mother, completely unfazed by her glaring disapproval. "I did not lose it, Mom," I said, my voice calm even and echoing clearly against the high ceilings of the suite. "I declined it and enlisted so I could pay Chloe's tuition when she failed out of her first semester." "You are welcome." The silence that descended upon the bridal suite was absolute and suffocating. It was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the silver champagne buckets. The bridesmaids stood frozen in shock, their perfectly made-up faces registering the massive family scandal I had just casually dropped into the open air. One of the makeup artists slowly lowered her brush and took a cautious step backward, trying to blend into the wallpaper. Brenda's mouth opened and closed without a sound, the carefully constructed mask of the elegant, long-suffering mother entirely shattered. She looked utterly panicked, her eyes darting toward Chloe's wealthy friends, realizing that the perfect family image she had spent decades curating had just been incinerated in a matter of seconds. Chloe spun around in her makeup chair so fast she nearly knocked over a tray of expensive cosmetics. The color drained completely from her contoured face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very small. She glared at me, her eyes flashing with a mixture of panic, humiliation, and a hatred so intense it threatened to crack her pristine bridal facade right down the middle. She gripped the armrests of her chair, her knuckles turning white, completely speechless as the truth she had spent 10 years running from was finally exposed to the very people she was trying so desperately to impress. The heavy silence in the bridal suite was suddenly shattered by the sound of deep booming laughter echoing from the corridor. The massive oak doors swung open completely, destroying the frozen tableau I had just created. Hunter Sterling, Chloe's fiancé, strolled into the room, followed closely by his father, Preston. The Sterling men moved with the kind of effortless, unbothered arrogance that only comes from generations of unchecked privilege and massive defense contractor wealth. They were tall, heavily tanned from weekend golf trips, and wearing custom-tailored suits that screamed old money. They operated in a world where they expected every door to open for them automatically and every person to step aside without question. Brenda instantly snapped out of her paralyzed state. The absolute panic in her eyes was immediately replaced by a frantic, fawning desperation to maintain the facade. She rushed forward aggressively, smoothing the front of her expensive dress, her voice jumping a full octave as she greeted the men who were about to elevate our family's social standing to the elite level she had always craved. Chloe forced a bright plastic smile onto her face. Her knuckles were still completely white as she gripped the edge of the makeup vanity, desperate to pretend that her carefully curated life had not just been exposed as a massive fraud in front of her entire bridal party. Hunter kissed Chloe on the cheek, murmuring something about the rehearsal dinner schedule running late before turning around to survey the room. That was when his eyes landed on me. He stopped mid-sentence. He looked me up and down, his gaze dragging lazily over my crisp white uniform, the polished gold buttons and the precise rows of ribbons on my chest. There was absolutely no recognition of military rank in his eyes, only a deep dismissive amusement. To Hunter, a black woman standing in a room full of affluent socialites could not possibly belong there as an equal. To him, the pristine uniform did not demand respect or signal authority. It simply meant I was hired help. Hunter smirked, letting out a short, condescending chuckle as he nudged his father. "Are you the venue security?" he asked, his voice intentionally loud enough to ensure every single person in the room was listening. "Because my family is flying in some actual VIPs tomorrow, a real Navy Special Warfare unit. Try not to embarrass us, okay?" Preston Sterling chuckled along with his son, swirling the ice in a glass of amber bourbon he had brought in from the hallway. He looked at me with the exact same dismissive inherited arrogance. "We handle billion-dollar logistics contracts for the Defense Department," Preston added, puffing out his chest, as if the room needed a reminder of his net worth. "We work directly with the top brass, the real decision-makers in Washington. We requested a dedicated security detail for our military guests, but I assumed the hotel would provide someone a bit more equipped for the job. Just make sure the perimeter is clear before the rehearsal dinner starts. We do not want any sloppy slip-ups when the actual officers arrive." I stood my ground, feeling the collective gaze of the bridesmaids burning into the side of my face. Brenda was holding her breath, her eyes wide and pleading with me to just swallow the insult, lower my head, and play along for the sake of the merger between our two families. Chloe looked suddenly triumphant, the color rushing back into her pale cheeks. She was clearly thrilled that her wealthy fiancé had just stepped in to put her rebellious sister back in her rightful place. They all expected me to snap. They expected me to raise my voice, to launch into a defensive rant, or to storm out of the suite in tears. They wanted the angry black woman stereotype they could later gossip about over cocktails and use as justification for why I was unfit for their high society world. But they had absolutely no idea who they were talking to. They saw a woman they could belittle and dismiss. They did not see an O5 commander in the United States Navy. They did not see the golden oak leaves on my collar that designated my senior officer rank and years of grueling command experience. They did not know that the very Navy Special Warfare Unit they were bragging about flying in answered directly to my chain of command. They had absolutely no clue that my tactical call sign, earned through blood sweat and highly classified operations in hostile territories around the globe, was Admiral. And they certainly did not know that my current deployment involved overseeing the exact same defense logistics contracts Preston Sterling's company was currently under federal investigation for mishandling. I was the very top brass decision-maker he was just boasting about. I felt a slow, razor-sharp smile spread across my face. I did not correct them. I did not shout my rank, demand a salute, or list my credentials to prove my worth to men who were entirely beneath my notice. True power does not need to announce itself in a crowded room full of fools. I looked Hunter directly in the eyes, holding his arrogant gaze with a chilling intensity until he shifted uncomfortably, the smirk faltering just a fraction on his handsome face. "I will make sure everything is handled exactly as it should be," I said, my voice perfectly level and terrifyingly calm. "I am very much looking forward to meeting your VIP guests tomorrow. I am quite sure it will be a deeply memorable experience for everyone involved." I gave a crisp textbook nod to the room, turned on my heel, and walked out of the bridal suite with my head held high. The heavy oak doors closed behind me with a satisfying final thud, leaving them to their cheap champagne and their fragile illusions. Let them enjoy their rehearsal dinner. Let them flaunt their inherited wealth and boast about their supposed military connections. Tomorrow the actual officers would arrive, and the Sterling men, along with my treacherous family, were going to learn a devastating and public lesson about who really commanded the room. The morning light poured through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the Buckhead Country Club, illuminating a room dripping with aggressive old money aesthetics. The rehearsal dinner the night before had gone off exactly as I predicted. It was a sterile, heavily choreographed parade of wealth where I sat quietly at the absolute furthest table from the head dais, completely ignored by my family. But the bridal brunch was supposed to be a more intimate affair. Intimate in my mother's vocabulary, meant reserving the entire sunroom overlooking the 18th hole and forcing 80 people to drink overpriced mimosas while pretending to genuinely like each other. I chose not to wear my uniform today. Instead, I wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit like armor, completely ignoring the pastel floral dress code my mother had demanded in a passive-aggressive group text at 2 in the morning. I walked into the sprawling dining hall, the air already humming with the sound of clinking silver and shallow networking laughter. Waiters in white gloves moved seamlessly between the round tables, pouring freshly squeezed orange juice and vintage champagne. I grabbed a cup of black coffee from a side station and leaned against a marble pillar near the center of the room. I had absolutely no interest in making small talk with distant relatives who had spent the last decade whispering about my supposed failures. I was here to observe the battlefield. Directly in the center of the room, Preston and Hunter Sterling were holding court. They had commandeered the largest table, completely ignoring the bride, the bridesmaids, and the actual wedding festivities. To the Sterling men, this brunch was not a celebration of love or family. It was a captive audience for a corporate pitch. Preston stood with his suit jacket unbuttoned, gesturing widely with a crystal glass in his hand, his voice booming effortlessly over the soft jazz playing through the overhead speakers. He wanted everyone in the room to know exactly how important he was. "We are entering a new era at Sterling Dynamics," Preston declared, his voice carrying across the sunroom. "You cannot just walk into the Pentagon and demand a billion-dollar defense contract anymore. The current administration wants a narrative. They want to see that we are actively supporting the warfighter on the ground. It is a dog and pony show, frankly, but we know exactly how to play the game better than anyone else in Washington." Hunter smirked, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms with that same unearned arrogance he had displayed in the bridal suite. "That is exactly why we flew in the Navy boys for tonight," Hunter added, raising his voice so the neighboring tables could clearly hear his strategic brilliance. "We reached out to our corporate contacts and sponsored a returning special warfare unit to attend the reception. We are putting them up in the penthouse suites, feeding them, giving them a weekend of absolute luxury. It is the ultimate PR flex. We get a few professional photos of me and Dad shaking hands with the real American heroes. We leak those photos to the defense trade publications, and it proves Sterling Dynamics is fundamentally aligned with military interests." Preston chuckled, taking a slow sip of his drink. "They are essentially highly trained props," he said smoothly. "You put a few shiny metals in the room, and the contract acquisition board eats it right up. We secure the billion-dollar logistics deal we have been chasing for 18 months, and all it cost us was a few hotel rooms and some open bar tabs for a bunch of guys who probably cannot afford a decent steak on a government salary anyway. It is an incredible return on investment." My stomach churned violently, but not just from the blatant insult to my brothers in arms. It churned because, standing right next to Preston, nodding enthusiastically and laughing at the punchline, was my father. Deacon Harrison, a man who preached about integrity, sacrifice, and moral fiber every Sunday from a massive pulpit, was practically bending over backward to agree with a man who viewed human lives and military service as cheap marketing tools. My father's eyes gleamed with a desperate, hungry light. He was entirely captivated by his proximity to the Sterling wealth. He wanted to be part of their elite club so badly that he was willing to smile along while they disrespected the very institution his own daughter served. He was actively participating in the degradation of his own values just to bask in the glow of white wealth that he believed finally validated our family's social standing. "Brilliant strategy, Preston," my father said, his voice slick with an embarrassing level of sycophancy. "In business, you have to use every resource at your disposal to secure the win. It is a masterful move. The optics alone will guarantee that contract. You are playing chess while your competitors are playing checkers." I took a slow sip of my black coffee, feeling the bitter heat slide down my throat to match the cold anger settling in my chest. The sheer, unadulterated hubris of these men was almost intoxicating to watch. They were so blinded by their own privilege that they felt completely comfortable loudly outlining a scheme to manipulate the Department of Defense in a public room. They assumed everyone present was either on their payroll, desperate to be on their payroll, or simply too ignorant to understand the massive legal and ethical implications of what they were saying. They felt invincible. What Preston and Hunter Sterling failed to realize as they toasted to their impending billion-dollar contract was the highly classified nature of my current deployment. I was not just some low-level logistics officer pushing paperwork in a dusty office. I was the lead operational auditor for the Defense Logistics Agency. I was the exact individual tasked with reviewing, approving, or denying the massive federal contract Sterling Dynamics was currently salivating over. I had spent the last 8 months embedded overseas compiling thousands of pages of classified reports detailing their company's chronic supply chain failures, gross overcharging, and blatant safety violations. They were bleeding the military dry cutting corners on tactical equipment that put my sailors in direct danger, all while throwing lavish parties back home and bragging about their political maneuvering. And tonight, the Special Warfare Unit they had invited as their personal PR props would arrive at the grand reception. The Navy SEAL team they planned to use for a photo opportunity was the same elite unit I had commanded during a highly classified Joint Task Force operation just 2 years ago. They were men who had bled beside me, men who knew me not as the bride's disgraced, socially awkward sister, but as Admiral. I watched my father pat Preston on the back, completely oblivious to the fact that he was tying his family's reputation to a rapidly sinking ship. He had traded his dignity for a seat at a table that was about to collapse. I set my empty coffee cup on a passing waiter's silver tray and smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit. The game was perfectly set. They had built the trap, loaded the bait, and locked the door themselves. All I had to do was wait for the sun to go down and let them introduce me to my own team. The morning sun continued to heat the glass of the sunroom, but the atmosphere around me remained ice cold. I stood by the marble pillar, perfectly content to let them dig their own graves with their loud, arrogant boasting. But Hunter Sterling could never just leave well enough alone. His ego required constant validation, and apparently my quiet presence was a threat to his absolute authority in the room. He spotted me standing there in my tailored charcoal suit, and a familiar predatory smirk stretched across his face. He nudged his father, then gestured toward me, leading Preston and my own father right into my personal space. So Maya Hunter said, his voice dripping with loud theatrical curiosity meant to draw the attention of the surrounding tables. "Chloe tells me you are actually active duty. I guess I should apologize for the security guard comment last night." He took a sip of his mimosa, not looking the least bit apologetic. "But you have to admit, it is hard to tell these days. They hand out officer ranks to anyone who fits a quota. Diversity hires pushing papers in a basement somewhere pretending they know what combat looks like. It is cute that you get to wear the shiny medals, though." The casual racism and sexism rolled off his tongue so naturally, it was clear he had never faced a single consequence in his life. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I waited for my father, the man who supposedly valued honor and integrity above all else, to defend his own blood. Instead, Deacon Harrison let out a nervous, high-pitched chuckle. He actually shrank in on himself, terrified that Hunter's mockery might somehow tarnish his own standing with the billionaire defense contractors. "You know how the modern military is?" Hunter, my father said, waving his hand dismissively in my direction, as if I were a mild annoyance he had regrettably invited. "They need their administrative staff to look good on the brochures. Maya has a desk job. She handles supply sheets and emails. It is perfectly safe, quiet work. Nothing like the real heroes you are bringing in tonight." The betrayal was so absolute, so thoroughly pathetic, that I almost felt sorry for him. Preston chuckled, slapping my father on the back in a gesture of wealthy solidarity. "Exactly," Preston boomed. "We need the girls in the back office keeping the coffee warm for the boys on the front lines. Do not worry, Maya. We will make sure you get a good view of the real operators tonight when they arrive." With that, Preston and Hunter turned and walked back toward their table, laughing loudly at their own recycled jokes. The second they were out of earshot, the nervous, fawning smile vanished from my father's face. His features hardened into a mask of pure, controlling rage. He grabbed my elbow. his grip bruising, and dragged me out of the sunroom and into an empty coat check alcove. He released me with a rough shove, breathing heavily, his eyes darting around to make sure no one of importance was witnessing his loss of composure. The heavy scent of expensive wool coats and stale air freshener filled the cramped space as he turned his fury entirely on me. "You are done trying to make a statement," my father hissed, his voice vibrating with suppressed fury. "I will not have you parading around in that rigid military uniform at the actual ceremony tonight trying to steal attention from your sister. You look completely unnatural. You look hard and masculine, and it is an embarrassment to this family. I do not care what rank you think you have achieved in your little desk job. You are forbidden from wearing that uniform to the wedding. You will find a quiet, appropriate dress, or you will not attend the ceremony at all." I smoothed the sleeve of my suit where he had grabbed me, my expression utterly blank. "Is that right?" I asked, my voice dangerously soft. My father reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a small white cardstock rectangle. He shoved it directly into my chest, forcing me to take it. I looked down at the delicate gold calligraphy. It was a place card for the grand reception. My name was written on it, but the table assignment had been aggressively crossed out with a thick black pen and rewritten. Table 99. I had seen the seating chart earlier that morning. The tables in the main ballroom only went up to 50. Table 99 was the vendor overflow table. It was located in the drafty service hallway directly next to the swinging kitchen doors, meant for the wedding photographer and the band members to eat their cold meals during breaks. My father, a man obsessed with appearances and social hierarchy, had literally relegated his own daughter to the kitchen to keep me hidden from his wealthy new in-laws. "You will sit where you are assigned," my father dictated, adjusting his silk tie and pulling his shoulders back to regain his faux dignity. "You will stay out of the professional photographs. You will not speak to the Sterling family, and you absolutely will not approach their military VIP guests. You have caused enough friction this weekend. This is Chloe's moment. You will stay in the shadows where you belong." I looked down at the battered place card in my hand, tracing the hastily scribbled number with my thumb. He genuinely thought this was a punishment. He genuinely believed that placing me next to the service doors would isolate me and break my spirit. He had no idea that the vendor table offered the absolute best tactical vantage point in the entire venue. From table 99, I would have a clear, unobstructed line of sight to the main entrance, the head table, and the exact corridor where the VIP guests would be escorted in. It was a commander's dream. I looked back up at the man who had spent 3 decades trying to make me feel small. I did not argue. I did not shed a single tear. I gave him the exact same cold, calculated smile I gave hostile negotiators during federal audits. "Understood," I said calmly. "I will sit exactly where you put me, and I will not wear my dress uniform to the ceremony. I will be wearing something much more appropriate for the evening." He let out a sharp breath of relief, foolishly assuming I had finally surrendered to his authority. He turned and marched back toward the sunroom to resume kissing the ground the Sterlings walked on. He walked away thinking he had won. He walked away thinking he had successfully hidden the family disappointment in the kitchen. But as I slipped the place card into my pocket, my pulse thrummed with a quiet, lethal anticipation. I did not need my dress uniform to command the incoming operators, and sitting in the shadows simply meant they would never see the strike coming. The trap was locked. Now it was just a matter of waiting for the sun to go down. I slipped the altered place card into my pocket in the coat check alcove, fully intending to use the service hallway as my tactical vantage point. But as my fingers brushed against the cheap, hastily scribbled cardstock, a different kind of resolve hardened in my chest. I had spent 10 years playing the obedient soldier for this family, taking their hits so they could shine in the spotlight. Sitting next to the kitchen's swinging doors was not a tactical advantage. It was an erasure. They wanted me out of sight so they could continue spinning their web of lies without the inconvenient truth staring back at them. And I was absolutely done being erased. I pulled the card back out of my pocket, smoothed the creased edges, and followed my father back into the sunlit dining room. He had already returned to the head table, hovering anxiously over Chloe and my mother, whispering about how he had successfully handled my insubordination. I walked straight up to the bridal table. The clinking of silver and the soft jazz music seemed to fade into the background as I approached. I did not slam my hand down. I did not shout. I simply reached out and dropped the crossed-out place card right onto Chloe's pristine porcelain plate. It landed with a soft, definitive tap. "I am not sitting by the kitchen doors," I announced. My voice was perfectly modulated, but carried enough weight to slice through the ambient chatter of the surrounding tables. "If I attend this reception tonight, I sit with my family. I am not the hired help, and I will not be treated like a dirty secret you need to hide from your wealthy new in-laws." My father's face drained of color. He darted a panicked glance across the room toward where Preston and Hunter Sterling were holding court, terrified that they had heard my quiet rebellion. Chloe stared at the place card sitting on her plate like it was a live grenade. For a second, she looked genuinely terrified. Then the performance began. Her bottom lip trembled, her breathing hitched in her chest. It was an absolute masterclass in theatrical manipulation, adapted perfectly for the wealthy Atlanta elite. She pushed her chair back so forcefully it scraped loudly against the marble floor, drawing the attention of several nearby guests. She let out a dramatic, breathy sob and covered her face with her manicured hands. "Why do you always do this to me?" Chloe wailed, her voice echoing across the sunroom. "Why do you have to ruin everything I have ever worked for?" She dropped her hands, her eyes flashing with a highly calculated rage. "This entire weekend has been meticulously curated," she cried, gesturing frantically at the floral arrangements and the crystal glasses. "And you bring this aggressive masculine military energy into every single room you enter. You walk around with your shoulders squared and that rigid posture, looking down on all of us like we are frivolous and stupid. You are completely ruining the aesthetic of my wedding. Hunter family is looking at us like we are uncultured, aggressive thugs because you refuse to just blend in and be elegant." Brenda swooped in immediately, wrapping a fiercely protective arm around Chloe's trembling shoulders. She stroked Chloe's hair, shooting me a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "Look what you have done, Maya," my mother hissed, her voice vibrating with toxic outrage. "You have upset the bride on the most important weekend of her life. You are so utterly consumed with your own selfish pride that you are destroying your sister's happiness." Brenda took a step toward me, lowering her voice to a vicious whisper so the other tables could not hear. "And do not think I did not see how you glared at Hunter earlier. He was merely making a light-hearted joke about diversity hires, and you stood there staring at him like an absolute criminal. You made him incredibly uncomfortable. You made the Sterling family uncomfortable. I demand you walk over to their table right this second and apologize to Hunter for your intimidating behavior." The sheer audacity of her demand hung in the air between us. The absolute delusion required to tell a decorated military officer to apologize to a spoiled, arrogant civilian for making him uncomfortable with her mere presence was staggering. I looked at my mother. I looked at my father, who was nodding in agreement with Brenda. I looked at my sister, who was peering out from behind our mother's shoulder, waiting for me to bow my head and submit. They were the holy trinity of hypocrisy, entirely willing to sacrifice my dignity to buy their way into white wealth. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I let the silence stretch until the weight of it forced my father to shift uncomfortably on his feet. "I will never apologize for making a mediocre man uncomfortable," I said. I dropped my voice to a command register that demanded immediate, terrifying silence from the three of them. "I will not apologize for the rigid posture that carried the heavy weight of this family reputation when Chloe was busy failing out of school." "You want to talk about my masculine military energy ruining your aesthetic? That exact energy paid for the custom designer dress Chloe will be wearing down the aisle. That military energy funded the out-of-state tuition that allowed her to stay in school and meet Hunter Sterling in the first place." I turned my gaze to my father, locking eyes with him until he was forced to look away. "You stood there and let a defense contractor mock my service," I said, every word slicing like a scalpel. "You let a man who profits off the blood of my sailors call me a diversity hire and treat me like a joke, all so you could beg for a seat at a table where you do not even belong. You sold out your own daughter for a photo opportunity. I turned back to my mother, stepping just a fraction of an inch closer, completely ignoring her look of shock. I earned every single piece of gold on my shoulders. I stated, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. I bled for my rank. I commanded men in hostile waters and navigated geopolitical crises while you were busy matching napkin rings to floral centerpieces and worrying about country club gossip. I have built a career based on honor and sacrifice, and I will not shrink myself to make your pathetic social climbing easier. I did not wait for a response. There was nothing left for them to say. I turned my back on their stunned faces, leaving the place card sitting on the table like a tombstone for our relationship. Let them panic. Let Brenda scramble to fix Chloe's ruined makeup. Let my father sweat over what the Sterlings might think. I had a grand evening reception to prepare for, and since my father had explicitly forbidden me from wearing my dress uniform, I knew exactly what kind of outfit I was going to wear to welcome my men. I had barely taken 3 steps toward the sunroom exit when my father's heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder, violently spinning me back around. He was entirely stripped of his pastoral grace, reduced to a desperate, sweating man whose absolute authority had just been publicly dismantled. His face was a dark, mottled red, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched collar. He was no longer worried about the other tables watching. He was operating on pure, humiliated adrenaline. "You are leaving right now!" My father hissed, his voice trembling with a rage so profound it bordered on violence. "You will walk out of this country club, you will pack your bags, and you will get on the next flight back to whatever military base you crawled out of. You are no longer welcome at this wedding, and you are no longer welcome in this family." I opened my mouth to tell him that getting kicked out of this pathetic circus was a promotion, but the words never left my lips. The heavy glass doors of the sunroom violently swung open, slamming against the brass stops with a deafening crash. The elegant jazz music seemed to instantly mute itself. Every head in the room, including my furious father, snapped toward the entrance. It was Simone, Chloe's high-end, ridiculously expensive wedding planner. Simone was a woman who practically breathed event management. She was known across Atlanta high society for maintaining absolute composure during hurricanes, power outages, and the most dramatic bridezilla meltdowns imaginable. But right now, Simone looked completely unhinged. Her signature leather clipboard was clutched against her chest like a shield, her immaculate updo was fraying at the edges, and her face was drained of all color. "We have a catastrophic problem," Simone announced. Her voice was pitched tight with panic, and she did not bother to whisper or pull my parents aside. The sheer urgency of the crisis erased all her professional discretion. My mother immediately stepped forward, waving her hands as if to physically push Simone's volume down. "Simone, lower your voice," Brenda demanded, glancing nervously toward the surrounding tables. "What could possibly be so urgent that you interrupt the bridal brunch? We are having a private family moment." Simone let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. "You are about to have an empty reception ballroom, Brenda. That is what is urgent." The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. Even Preston and Hunter Sterling, who had been laughing loudly just moments before, stopped their conversation and turned their attention to the commotion. "What are you talking about?" Chloe demanded, her voice shrill and terrified as she clutched the edge of the table. "The reception is in 6 hours. The catering company and the floral design team are currently packing up their trucks at the loading dock," Simone stated clearly, her voice echoing in the dead silent room. "They are threatening to drive away right now and take the custom menus, the centerpieces, the imported orchids, and the entire dinner service with them." My father puffed out his chest, stepping away from me and sliding back into his role as the wealthy patriarch handling a minor logistical hiccup. "That is absurd. We signed ironclad contracts. If this is about the final installment, I was assured by your team that the payment was processed automatically this morning." "It was processed," Simone said, her voice dropping a fraction, but still carrying a devastating clarity. "And it bounced. The final $50,000 charge was declined by the bank." My father's face contorted in confusion. "That is impossible. My accounts are perfectly fine. It was not run on your account." Deacon Simone corrected, turning her gaze toward the center of the room. The final payment was placed on Preston Sterling's corporate black card, exactly as instructed yesterday to cover the sudden upgrades to the VIP menus. The card was declined. I tried running it 3 times. The bank placed a hard freeze on the account. The silence that followed was absolute suffocating and beautifully destructive. I watched my mother's perfectly lifted face freeze in sheer horror. She slowly turned her head toward Preston Sterling, the invincible, untouchable defense contractor who had just spent the entire morning loudly bragging about his endless wealth and his billion-dollar government contracts. Suddenly looked like a deer caught in the headlights. Hunter's smug, arrogant smirk was wiped entirely off his handsome face. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, frantically swiping across the screen to open his banking application. I watched his face drain of blood as he stared at whatever red error message was flashing back at him. I stood there feeling a profound, chilling sense of satisfaction wash over me as the pristine illusion of the Sterling Empire cracked right down the middle. I knew exactly why that card was declined. I knew exactly why a hard freeze had been placed on their corporate accounts. Federal investigations into gross mismanagement of Department of Defense funds do not just end with a slap on the wrist. When the Oversight Committee finds millions of dollars unaccounted for, they lock down the assets immediately. My audit, the highly classified, devastatingly thorough report I had finalized and submitted securely just hours before boarding my flight to Atlanta, was already triggering federal action. The relentless gears of justice were turning, and they were grinding Preston Sterling's massive credit lines into dust right in the middle of a country club. The man who had mocked me as a diversity hire was currently being financially crippled by my signature. "There must be a mistake with the fraud department," Preston boomed, recovering his voice but severely overcompensating with volume. His face was flushed a dark, angry red. "It is a security measure. It happens with large, unexpected charges. I will call my wealth manager right now and have it cleared up in 2 minutes." But the damage was already done. The veneer of untouchable white wealth that my parents had so desperately worshipped, the wealth they were willing to sacrifice my dignity to align themselves with, had just been publicly questioned. My father looked completely lost, his eyes darting between the panicked wedding planner and the sweating billionaire he had just been groveling to. Chloe let out a genuine, piercing wail of despair, realizing her fairy tale wedding was actively being packed into the back of delivery trucks. I looked at my father, who was still standing a few feet away from me. His threat to kick me out was completely forgotten in the wake of this absolute disaster. He had sold his soul for a seat at a table that could not even afford to pay the catering bill. I did not laugh. I did not gloat. I simply adjusted the cuffs of my charcoal suit, gave my panicking family one final pitying look, and walked smoothly toward the sunroom exit. Let them scramble to pay the vendors. Let them panic over the frozen accounts. I had a grand evening reception to prepare for, and I was feeling incredibly inspired. I had barely crossed the threshold of the sunroom, the frantic shouts of the wedding planner fading behind me, when a heavy, desperate hand clamped down on my wrist for the second time that morning. My father did not care about the optics anymore. He practically dragged me across the foyer and shoved me into the private coat room, kicking the heavy mahogany door shut behind us. The sudden silence was jarring. The small windowless space smelled of cedar and expensive dry cleaning. My father released my wrist and began pacing the narrow floor. He was sweating profusely. The pristine collar of his custom-tailored shirt was damp and limp, and he reached up to loosen his silk tie with shaking fingers. The polished, untouchable Deacon Harrison was completely gone. In his place was a frantic, cornered man watching his social empire crumble in real time. "You need to fix this," my father demanded. His voice was a harsh, breathless rasp entirely stripped of its usual pastoral grace. "You need to wire $50,000 to the venue right now." I stood leaning against a row of heavy winter coats, crossing my arms over my charcoal suit. I looked at him as if he had just suggested we fly to the moon. I simply stared, letting the sheer absurdity of his demand echo in the small room. My father stopped pacing and stepped toward me, his eyes wide and pleading, but lined with that familiar demanding authority. "You have military banking," he instructed rapidly, dictating the terms, as if I were a subordinate who had no choice but to comply. "I know they offer instant approval signature loans for senior officers. You can log into your account right now and request an emergency wire transfer. Tell them it is a family crisis. Tell them whatever you have to tell them, but you need to get that money cleared before those catering trucks pull out of the driveway." I tilted my head, studying him with cold clinical detachment. "Why do you not pay for it yourself?" I asked. "You and Brenda are supposedly the elite of Atlanta. Write a check." He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed purple. "Our assets are tied up in real estate and long-term trusts," he stammered, avoiding my direct gaze. "Liquidating $50,000 on a Saturday morning is impossible without raising red flags with our financial managers. And Preston Sterling's accounts are locked. If we do not pay the vendors right now, the wedding is over. The entire city will know. We will be the laughing stock of the country club. So let me make sure I understand the tactical objective here," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "You want me to take out a high-interest military loan, plunging myself into massive debt to fund a lavish party for a billionaire defense contractor who just called me a diversity hire, and a sister who threw a tantrum because my military posture ruined her aesthetic." My father slammed his hand against the wooden paneling of the wall. "Do not act like you do not owe this family." "Maya," he snapped, unleashing the ultimate weapon he had used to control his congregation and his children for decades. "You think your little Navy career happened in a vacuum. Your mother and I worked our entire lives to build a legacy in this city. We paved the way for you. You are a successful Black woman because we gave you the foundation to be one. It is called the Black Tax, Maya. When you make it out, you give back. You carry the family. It is your absolute duty as the older sister to step up and protect our reputation when we are in crisis." He took another step closer, lowering his voice into the rhythmic guilt-inducing cadence he used behind the pulpit. "Honor thy father and mother, Maya. God expects us to bear one another's burdens. Your sister is out there crying. Our family is on the brink of absolute public humiliation. You have the power to save us. If you walk out that door without transferring those funds, you are turning your back on your own blood. You will be responsible for destroying Chloe's special day." I let him finish his desperate sermon. I watched him weaponize our culture, our religion, and our family history, twisting all of it into a desperate extortion attempt to save his own fragile ego. He wanted me to believe that my success was a debt. I owed them a debt they could aggressively collect whenever they needed to fund their illusions of grandeur. I uncrossed my arms and stood to my full height, forcing him to look up slightly to meet my eyes. "My duty is to the United States Constitution and the sailors under my command." I stated my words, dropping like anvils onto the plush carpet. "I do not owe a single dime to a family that rewrote my history to cover up Chloe's failures. I already paid my Black Tax, Dad. I paid it 10 years ago when I signed over my enlistment bonuses, so you could afford her tuition after she partied away her freshman year. You spent my sacrifice to protect her reputation, and I am not giving you another cent to protect yours." My father looked as though I had physically struck him. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He was completely out of ammunition. He had tried to shame me, he had tried to order me, and he had tried to exploit my guilt, but he was finally realizing that he had absolutely no leverage left. The daughter he had relegated to the kitchen vendor table was the only person in the room with the capital to save him, and she was refusing to play the game. "Do not ever quote scripture to justify your financial mismanagement," I added, stepping around him toward the door. "And do not ever invoke family loyalty when you just spent the entire morning laughing along with a man who disrespected my uniform." I placed my hand on the brass doorknob, turning back to him one last time. He looked broken, leaning heavily against the wall, the sweat now visibly soaking through his expensive jacket. "Tell Simone she should probably let the caterers go," I said with a tight, polite smile. "Cold food really ruins a high society aesthetic." I opened the heavy mahogany door and stepped back out into the brightly lit foyer, leaving my father alone in the dark, suffocating coat room to face the absolute destruction of the empire he had built on lies. The reception was only hours away, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. I had my hand on the cool brass of the doorknob, fully prepared to step out into the blinding light of the foyer and leave my father suffocating in the dark. But before I could turn the latch, his heavy palm slammed flat against the solid mahogany above my head. He pushed the door shut with a desperate, heavy thud. He was breathing like a man who had just run a marathon, his chest heaving under his sweat-soaked designer shirt. "You do not understand the magnitude of this," my father gasped, dropping all pretenses and practically begging. "Maya, please. We put everything into securing this venue. We drained the liquid accounts to pay for Chloe's custom dress, the imported flowers, the string quartet. Preston Sterling was only supposed to cover the catering and the VIP upgrades. If that catering bill is not paid, Preston will know we are tapped out. He will know we do not have the capital to be in his inner circle. You cannot let them see us fail." I looked at his outstretched arm blocking my exit. I looked at the sheer, unadulterated panic in his eyes. He actually believed he was the architect of this grand illusion. He genuinely thought he had single-handedly built the pristine facade he was currently begging me to protect. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice or launch into another fiery speech about respect and boundaries. Instead, a sound bubbled up from the very bottom of my chest. It started as a low chuckle and quickly grew into a full, resonant, unapologetic laugh. My laughter bounced off the cedar-paneled walls of the tiny coat room. It was not a bitter laugh. It was a sound of pure, liberated amusement. My father recoiled as if I had slapped him. His eyes went wide with confusion and horror. To a man who demanded absolute reverence, being laughed at during his moment of supreme crisis was worse than being yelled at. "You think this is funny?" he hissed, his voice trembling. "Our family reputation is burning to the ground out there, and you are laughing." "I am laughing, Dad, because your delusion is truly a masterpiece," I said, shaking my head. I took a step back, giving myself room to reach into the inner pocket of my tailored charcoal suit. "You just stood there and told me that you and Brenda put everything into securing this venue. You stood there and acted like you are the sole provider, the wealthy patriarch holding this dynasty together." I pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated the dim space between us. I bypassed the notifications, opened my secure banking application, and navigated to my archived financial statements. I knew exactly which file to look for. I had kept it downloaded and saved for this exact moment, a digital ace tucked up my sleeve for the inevitable day they tried to rewrite history again. I opened the PDF document, zoomed in on a specific transaction from exactly 6 months ago, and held the glowing screen directly up to his face. "Look at it," I commanded, my voice dropping its amusement and shifting back to absolute authority. "Read the line item out loud." My father blinked, squinting at the bright screen. I watched his eyes track the digital text. I watched his pupils dilate as he recognized the bold, undeniable numbers stamped across the bank document. $30,000, I stated quietly when he refused to speak. "A direct wire transfer from my Navy Federal account to the Buckhead Estate Private Events Billing Department." The memo line clearly reads, "Chloe Harrison Wedding Deposit." His face completely drained of whatever color was left. The aggressive, demanding posture he had maintained just moments ago evaporated, leaving him looking hollow and utterly defeated. "Did you really think I forgot, Dad?" I asked, lowering the phone but keeping my eyes locked on his. "Did you think I forgot the frantic phone call I received while I was stationed overseas 6 months ago?" You were practically in tears. Your commercial real estate investments had taken a massive dive. Your liquid assets were tied up in bad stock bets, and the Buckhead estate was threatening to cancel Chloe's reservation because your initial deposit check bounced. I took a step closer, backing him against the wall of heavy winter coats. "You begged me. You pleaded with me to wire the funds immediately so your precious golden child would not lose her dream venue. And because I was still playing the role of the dutiful daughter, still hoping to earn a scrap of your approval, I drained my personal savings and paid it." My father swallowed hard, unable to look me in the eye. He stared at the carpet, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. But that is not even the best part. I continued, my voice smooth as glass. The best part is what you did after I saved you. You took my $30,000, secured this massive dripping in wealth venue, and then you spent the next 6 months parading around Atlanta society taking all the credit. You shook hands with Preston Sterling, drank his top-shelf scotch, and let him believe you were an equal billionaire, single-handedly financing a society wedding of the decade. I tapped the screen of my phone, locking it with a sharp, decisive click. You deliberately hid my contribution from the Sterling family because admitting you needed a bailout from your military daughter did not fit your narrative. You played the wealthy king, all while standing on a foundation I bought and paid for. The silence in the room was suffocating. I let him drown in it for a moment, let him choke on the absolute, undeniable proof of his own hypocrisy. And after all of that, I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper, after I literally bought the roof over your head this weekend, you had the unmitigated audacity to hand me a place card for table 99. You tried to stick me next to the kitchen swinging doors in the very building I paid to keep open. He opened his mouth desperately, searching for an excuse, a rationalization, anything to salvage his shattered ego. Maya, I just wanted to make sure Chloe had the perfect day. We were going to pay you back after the wedding. Once the merger with the Sterling family was secure, the financial benefits would have covered everything. Stop, I commanded, cutting him off completely. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending this was a temporary loan. We both know you never intended to acknowledge what I did. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and smoothed my lapels. The anger that had been simmering inside me for years was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, crystal-clear sense of peace. I finally saw him for exactly what he was. He was simply a small, insecure man hiding behind a designer suit and a hollow reputation. That $30,000 was the very last installment of the black tax I will ever pay, I stated firmly. Consider it a highly expensive lesson in humility. Now, if you will excuse me, I am going to go enjoy the venue I paid for. I suggest you get out there and figure out how to explain to your billionaire friends why they are not getting any dinner tonight. I reached past him, wrapped my hand around the cool brass knob, and pulled the heavy door open. I did not look back as I stepped out of the suffocating darkness and back into the bright, chaotic reality of a high society disaster in full swing. I had one foot over the threshold, the ambient noise of the panicking country club washing over me when my father moved faster than a man his age should be able to. He did not grab my arm this time. He knew better. Instead, he slammed his hand flat against the doorframe, physically barricading my exit. The sheer desperation that had possessed him moments ago evaporated entirely. The sweating, pleading man vanished, replaced by a cornered predator. Stripped of his leverage, his guilt trips, and his fake pastoral charm, Deacon Harrison resorted to the only weapon he had left in his arsenal, pure, unadulterated venom. "You are not walking away from me," he snarled, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly pitch that he usually reserved for condemning sinners from his pulpit. I stood my ground, looking at the arm blocking my path. "I already have, Dad. Move your arm." I am absolutely flatly refusing to pay another single dime to fund my own humiliation. I stated my words precise and cold. You are not getting $50,000 from me. You are not getting 50 cents. You can take your place card for table 99 and try using it to pay the caterers out there. When the finality of my refusal fully registered in his eyes, his entire face contorted. The mask slipped completely and irreparably. For 32 years, he had maintained a veneer of respectable disappointment toward me, but now the raw, unfiltered hatred bled through. He looked at me, not as his child, but as an enemy combatant who had just outmaneuvered him on his own battlefield. "You ungrateful, arrogant disgrace," he spat, leaning in so close I could smell the stale coffee and bitter panic on his breath. "You think you are so powerful in that tailored suit. You think because you have a few brass buttons and a rank that nobody outside a military base even understands you are suddenly an equal in this family. You are absolutely nothing." He let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sounded more like a bark. "You look down on Chloe. You look down on Preston and Hunter. But what are you really? You are just a government paycheck, Maya. You are a civil servant living off taxpayer dollars, while the people in this room build actual empires. You think your little $30,000 deposit gives you ownership over us. That is pocket change to the sterlings. It is a rounding error to the men out there doing real business. If it is pocket change, then go ask them for it, I countered smoothly, never once breaking eye contact. Oh wait, you cannot, because their credit cards are currently bouncing all over Atlanta and their accounts are frozen solid. My calm, calculated response only fueled his rage. He hated that I was not reacting. He hated that his insults, the exact same ones that used to send me spiraling into self-doubt as a teenager, were now just bouncing off me like rain off a titanium hull. He wanted to break me down to my core, to reduce me to the insecure girl who used to beg for his validation. He raised his hand and pointed a shaking finger directly an inch from my face. His hand was trembling so violently, I thought he might be having a medical episode, but it was just pure, unbridled fury, manifesting physically. Let me make this perfectly clear to you, my father dictated, his voice vibrating with absolute malice. You are going to transfer that money right now. You are going to fix this disaster, or you are completely done in this family. I will cut you off entirely. I will erase you from the estate, from the holiday dinners, from everything we have built. You will be a ghost to us. He took a deep breath, his chest heaving as he delivered his final absolute ultimatum. If you do not pay this right now, do not even bother walking through those chapel doors today. You will not be welcome at the ceremony. You will not be welcome at the reception. You will no longer be my daughter. The words hung in the heavy cedar-scented air between us, thick and final. This was the moment he thought would break me. This was his nuclear option. In his mind, the threat of being officially excommunicated from the elite Harrison family dynasty was the most devastating punishment imaginable. He expected me to crumble. He expected the fear of ultimate rejection to finally bring me to my knees. He waited for the panic to set in, for the apologies to start, for me to frantically pull out my phone and wire the money to save my place in his twisted hierarchy. Instead, I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of liberation wash over my entire body. It was as if a massive, suffocating weight I had been carrying on my shoulders for over 3 decades simply evaporated into thin air. He had just handed me the exact key I needed to unlock my own cage. I looked at his shaking finger. I looked at his red, furious face. I did not see a powerful patriarch anymore. I saw a small, pathetic man who had built a house of cards and was currently screaming at the wind for blowing it down. Are we clear? He demanded, stepping closer, trying to force me to flinch backward. Crystal clear, I replied, my voice light and completely unbothered. I reached up and gently but firmly pushed his shaking finger away from my face. But you seem to be operating under a massive tactical miscalculation, Dad. You are threatening to take away something I do not even want anymore. I stepped right up to the threshold, forcing him to either drop his arm or be physically pushed aside. You think cutting me off is a punishment? It is a promotion. You think banning me from a chapel where my sister is marrying a fraudulent, arrogant civilian is going to break my heart? It is the best gift you have ever given me. I paused, letting a slow, razor-sharp smile cross my face. Keep your chapel doors closed, Dad. Keep your vendor tables and your fake country club aesthetics. I am not paying your $50,000 ransom, and I am certainly not watching Chloe walk down the aisle. But I am not leaving the premises either. I am a registered guest at this hotel, and I have a front row seat to watch the Sterling Dynamics empire burn to the ground tonight. I would not miss the evening reception for the world. With a final, perfectly executed pivot, I stepped past him and walked out into the chaotic sunlight of the country club, leaving Deacon Harrison choking on his own toxic ultimatum. I did not even make it to the valet stand before my father's frantic, heavy footsteps echoed across the polished marble floor behind me. I stopped right outside the luxurious lounge where the bridal party had stored their luggage earlier that morning. He had chased me down, his face a mask of desperate fury, still foolishly waiting for me to crack under the pressure of his ultimatums. I walked right past him, retrieved my sleek black overnight bag from a velvet armchair, and unzipped it. I looked at my father with absolute ice in my veins. The man who had spent my entire life trying to shrink me to fit his narrow suburban narrative was now sweating through his custom Italian suit, completely powerless. I packed my overnight bag with slow, deliberate, and military precision. I smoothed out the fabric of my belongings, tucking them away as if I had all the time in the world. He watched my hands, his jaw clenching so tightly I could hear his teeth grinding together. He wanted me to panic. He wanted me to scramble. He got absolute chilling silence instead. I zipped the heavy canvas bag shut and slung the strap over my shoulder. I stepped into his personal space, forcing him to look me directly in the eyes. "I will not pay the $50,000, I told him softly, my voice carrying the lethal, unwavering calm of a commanding officer issuing a final directive. "But I will definitely be walking through those doors tonight, and you are going to beg me not to leave." I did not wait for his response. I simply turned on my heel and walked out of the country club, leaving him stranded in the hallway to deal with the catastrophic financial collapse of his own making. The blazing Atlanta sun hit my face as I stepped out onto the pristine driveway. I handed my ticket to the valet, tipped him generously, and slid into the driver's seat of my rental car. As I drove away from the rolling green golf courses and the superficial glamour of the Buckhead elite, I felt an incredible surge of adrenaline pumping through my system. The suffocating weight of family expectations was entirely gone. I headed straight back to the downtown luxury hotel where the grand wedding reception was scheduled to take place. The lobby was already bustling with floral teams and lighting technicians frantically trying to set up, completely unaware that the billionaire family supposedly funding their paychecks was currently facing a massive federal asset freeze. I bypassed the chaos, stepped into the private elevator, and swiped my keycard to access my suite on the upper floors. My hotel room was a quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary. The heavy blackout curtains shielded the space from the afternoon sun, casting the room in a cool, calming shadow. I dropped my overnight bag onto the luggage rack and let out a long, steadying breath. It was time to shed the civilian disguise. It was time to stop playing the role of the polite, accommodating sister who wore muted suits just to avoid upsetting her fragile mother. I walked over to the closet and unzipped the heavy protective vinyl garment bag hanging inside. The crisp, immaculate fabric of my Navy service dress white uniform practically glowed in the dim light. Putting on this uniform was a sacred ritual. Every single piece of it represented a hurdle I had cleared, an obstacle I had destroyed, and a sacrifice I had made while my family was busy attending country club galas. I dressed methodically. I buttoned the pristine white tunic, the fabric tailored to fit me like a suit of modern armor. I adjusted the stiff collar, feeling the heavy, polished gold oak leaves resting on my shoulders. Those leaves commanded respect from admirals and generals in the most secure briefing rooms in the world. They were not handed to me because of a diversity quota, as Hunter Sterling had so arrogantly suggested. They were forged in the fires of tactical operations and earned through relentless, agonizing dedication. Then came the ribbons and the medals. I aligned the colorful rows perfectly above my left breast pocket, ensuring every millimeter was up to regulation standards. Finally, I opened a small velvet box, sitting on the mahogany dresser. Resting inside on a bed of dark satin was the Navy Cross. It is the second highest military decoration awarded for extraordinary heroism in combat. I had earned that medal during a classified deployment, pulling my team out of a completely collapsed extraction zone under heavy, sustained enemy fire. I had carried 2 wounded men on my back while holding the line, refusing to retreat until every single sailor under my command was safe. I picked up the heavy metal medal, feeling the cold weight of it between my fingers. This was the irrefutable proof of exactly who I was. It was proof that I did not belong at a vendor table near the kitchen doors. I pinned the Navy Cross perfectly over my heart, the bronze glinting sharply in the light. I took a step back and looked at myself in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back at me was not a disappointed daughter. She was not a bitter sister or a corporate outcast. She was Commander Harrison. Her tactical call sign was Admiral, and she was about to execute the most flawless, devastating operation of her entire career. I picked up my encrypted government communication device from the nightstand. The screen lit up with secure notifications. My audit had officially reached the highest levels of the Defense Logistics Agency. The federal investigators were aggressively squeezing Sterling Dynamics, effectively cutting off their access to every major line of credit they possessed. Furthermore, my secure channel confirmed that the returning Navy Special Warfare Unit had just landed at the airport and was currently en route to the hotel. My boys were arriving. The trap was completely set. My father and the Sterling men had spent the entire morning bragging about their power, their wealth, and their untouchable influence. They had built a beautiful, towering house of cards entirely on the assumption that I was a powerless administrative worker they could easily shove into the shadows. I checked the heavy gold watch on my wrist. It was time to head down to the grand ballroom. I smoothed the front of my pristine white tunic, unlocked my hotel door, and walked out into the corridor. The wedding reception was about to begin, and I was going to ensure that everyone in that room remembered my name. I stepped out of the private elevator, the heavy bronze of my Navy cross resting coolly against my chest. But before making my grand entrance onto the main floor, I slipped into the shadowed mezzanine overlooking the grand chapel doors. I wanted to watch the preamble. I wanted to see exactly how Preston and Hunter Sterling handled themselves when confronted with actual breathing lethality. The opulent chapel attached to the Buckhead estate was filling up rapidly. A string quartet played a sanitized, elegant classical piece from the front corner, desperately trying to set a romantic mood that did not actually exist. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. My father sat in the front row, sweating profusely through his custom suit, aggressively pretending that the catering company had not just threatened a massive walkout a few hours prior. Brenda was furiously whispering instructions to the ushers, frantically trying to maintain her flawless high society aesthetic. But the real show was happening right at the arched mahogany entrance at the back of the hall. Preston and Hunter Sterling stood at the double doors like eager bouncers at an exclusive nightclub. They had completely abandoned their duties as the groom and the father of the groom to play corporate sharks. They were buzzing with greedy anticipation, adjusting their silk ties, and holding thick stacks of heavy embossed Sterling Dynamics business cards. They genuinely believed this was a high-level networking event. They thought they had just purchased a petting zoo of military heroes to parade around for their upcoming defense contract bid. They were waiting to collect their return on investment. Then the heavy exterior doors swung wide open. The ambient shallow chatter in the chapel instantly died down. 67 United States Navy SEALs walked into the foyer. They were not wearing the tailored, delicate tuxedos of the Atlanta elite. They were in full, immaculate service dress uniforms. It was an absolute sea of crisp fabric, pristine white gloves, and rows of combat decorations that commanded immediate, suffocating silence. These were men forged in freezing oceans, hostile deserts, and classified war zones. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace, their footsteps hitting the polished marble floor in perfect, heavy unison. The sheer physical presence of them sucked the oxygen right out of the lavish room. Preston's eyes lit up with dollar signs. He nudged Hunter, and the two of them eagerly stepped directly into the path of the incoming operators, completely blocking the main aisle. Hunter plastered on his most arrogant frat boy smile and thrust his hand out toward the lead operator. The man leading the formation was a towering Master Chief with a jawline carved from granite and eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world. "Welcome, gentlemen," Hunter boomed, raising his voice so the seated high society guests could clearly hear his philanthropic flex. "Hunter Sterling, Sterling Dynamics. We are the ones footing the bill for your stay this weekend. Glad we could fly you boys out here away from the trenches." Hunter aggressively shoved a thick, gold-lettered business card directly toward the Master Chief's chest. "Make sure you hold on to that. When you guys finally transition to the private sector and want to make some real money, Sterling Dynamics always has room for operators who know how to play the corporate game." The Master Chief did not blink. He did not slow his stride. He did not even look down at the business card. He simply kept his eyes locked straight ahead, his expression carved from absolute terrifying ice. He moved forward, with the unstoppable momentum of a freight train, forcing Hunter to either step immediately out of the way or get physically trampled by 220 pounds of combat-hardened muscle. Hunter stumbled backward, his arrogant smile faltering violently as his hand awkwardly dropped to his side. The expensive business card slipped from his fingers and fluttered pathetically to the marble floor, getting trampled under the polished black shoes of the advancing unit. Preston Sterling tried to salvage the botched interaction, stepping up to the next row of men with a desperate, sweaty grin. "Now listen, fellas, we have a hospitality suite set up with top-shelf bourbon for after the ceremony. We would love to talk about our logistics pipeline." He was cut off entirely. The SEALs did not acknowledge him. 67 highly lethal operators marched straight past the billionaire defense contractors as if they were absolutely invisible. They did not stop to mingle. They did not shake hands. They did not take their seats in the designated ribbon-tied guest pews that Brenda had so carefully arranged. Instead, they moved directly to the very back of the grand chapel and halted. In perfect spine-chilling synchronization, they pivoted, squared their broad shoulders, and assumed a rigid parade rest. 67 men forming a solid, impenetrable wall of white, gold, and brass across the entire back of the hall. They stood with their hands clasped behind their backs and their feet shoulder-width apart, entirely motionless. The temperature in this room plummeted. The intimidating presence of the unit was overwhelming. They were not there as wedding guests. They were there as an honor guard. They were waiting for their commanding officer. The high society guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, whispering nervously to one another. They suddenly realized that this was not a cute PR stunt. The Sterlings had completely lost control of the room. Preston and Hunter were left standing awkwardly near the entrance, looking utterly foolish, entirely ignored, and visibly sweating. Their grand networking opportunity had just flatlined in front of the entire Atlanta elite. Up in the shadowed mezzanine, a slow, predatory smile spread across my face. The pieces were perfectly in position. The Sterling men had been publicly dismissed. My father was drowning in a financial panic of his own making, and my boys were holding the line. I adjusted the cuffs of my pristine white tunic, took a deep, steadying breath, and prepared to walk down the grand, sweeping staircase. It was finally time for the Admiral to enter the room. I descended the grand, sweeping staircase of the main hotel building and bypassed the chaotic lobby, stepping out into the humid, heavy Atlanta afternoon. A sleek black town car was waiting at the curb to drive me the short quarter-mile across the sprawling Buckhead estate to the chapel doors. I slid into the cool leather back seat, the tinted windows offering me a final quiet moment of absolute solitude before the impending storm. The short drive felt like crossing a physical threshold between my past and my future. I was no longer the obedient scapegoat showing up to bear the brunt of my family's insecurities. I was the architect of their reckoning. The estate chapel was a towering, magnificent structure of glass and stone, designed specifically to showcase the extreme wealth of the families who rented it. Massive floor-to-ceiling stained glass windows flanked the heavy oak doors, providing a crystal-clear view from the altar straight out to the manicured circular driveway. As the town car glided smoothly onto the cobblestone path and pulled to a halt right in front of the VIP entrance, I could look straight through the pristine glass into the brightly lit sanctuary. There he was. Deacon Harrison stood near the front pews, desperately trying to maintain his pastoral composure, while the reality of his imminent financial ruin chewed a hole straight through his stomach. He was pacing nervously back and forth across the altar steps, aggressively adjusting his custom silk cuffs. Every few seconds he shot terrified, panicked glances toward the back of the room, where my 67 operators currently stood like an immovable titanium wall. He was a man entirely out of options, trapped in a room with defense contractors whose credit cards were bouncing, and military men who refused to acknowledge his existence. Then he turned his head and looked through the massive arched window. He spotted the black car idling at the curb. Even from a distance, I could see his entire body go completely rigid. The color drained rapidly from his face, replaced almost instantly by a violent mottled flush of pure outrage. He had genuinely believed his courtroom ultimatum would work. He had staked his entire fragile ego on the assumption that I would either wire the $50,000 in a desperate, pathetic bid for his approval, or I would flee to the airport in absolute shame. He expected me to be gone banished to the shadows so he could continue spinning his web of lies without my inconvenient reality standing in the way. Seeing my car parked boldly at the main entrance completely shattered his delusion. He was not looking at a defeated daughter. He was looking at a woman who had blatantly defied his direct command. I watched through the tinted glass as he yanked his phone from his jacket pocket. His thumbs flew aggressively across the screen, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. He was trying to exert control the only way he knew how, using the same toxic, manipulative cruelty that had kept me in line for 3 decades. A second later, the encrypted device in my hand vibrated with an incoming text. I looked down at the bright screen. The message glared back at me, dripping with his desperate need to break my spirit. "No one cares about your Navy career. Stay out of sight or leave." I read the words slowly, letting the sheer pathetic nature of his threat wash over me. He was standing in a chapel, facing total public humiliation, yet his biggest priority was trying to diminish my achievements to protect a billionaire family that could not even afford their own catering bill. 10 years ago, a text like that would have crushed me. It would have sent me retreating to my hotel room in tears, wondering why my own father hated my success so deeply. I would have quietly slipped out the side door, packed my bags, and disappeared just to keep the peace. But today, sitting in the back of that car, I did not feel a single ounce of hurt rejection or sadness. I felt nothing but absolute freezing ice in my veins. His words had absolutely no power over me anymore. They were just the frantic, empty threats of a small man who realized his empire of lies was burning to the ground. He was begging me to stay out of sight because he was absolutely terrified of what would happen if I stepped into the light. I did not type a reply. I did not owe him a response, an explanation, or a defense of my career. I pressed the side button, locking the screen with a sharp, definitive click, and slipped the phone deep into my pocket. I reached for the chrome door handle. I pushed the heavy car door open and stepped out into the blinding Georgia sun. The afternoon light hit the crisp, immaculate white fabric of my service dress uniform, making it practically glow against the dark backdrop of the vehicle. I stood to my full height, rolling my shoulders back and feeling the heavy, polished gold oak leaves resting perfectly on my collar. The rows of colorful ribbons on my chest caught the light, but it was the heavy bronze of the Navy Cross pinned directly over my heart that commanded the most attention. It was the undeniable physical proof of my courage, my sacrifice, and my absolute authority. The valet attendants and event staff bustling around the courtyard completely stopped what they were doing. They stared in silent awe as I straightened my tunic and adjusted my cover. I was not sneaking through the service corridor. I was not hiding at table 99 near the kitchen doors. I walked forward with slow, measured, completely unbothered steps, my polished shoes clicking sharply against the cobblestone. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead on the heavy mahogany chapel doors. My father had told me to stay out of sight, but I was about to give him a spectacle he would never, ever forget. I bypassed the discreet side walkway entirely. The winding, ivy-covered path that led toward the service entrance and the catering kitchens was exactly where my father expected me to go. It was the designated route for the invisible, the hired help, the people who were meant to make the day run smoothly without ever being seen or acknowledged by the wealthy guests. My father had undoubtedly instructed the venue staff to intercept me and herd me toward table 99 the moment I arrived. I did not even glance in that direction. My polished white shoes struck the central cobblestone promenade with a steady rhythmic cadence. The sharp authoritative sound cut through the humid Georgia air like a metronome, counting down the final seconds of my family's carefully curated illusion. Event staff carrying towering arrangements of white hydrangeas and silver trays of champagne practically tripped over their own feet to scramble out of my way. They recognized absolute authority when they saw it. They parted like the Red Sea as I marched directly up the center aisle of the pristine, sunlit courtyard. As I drew closer to the massive arched entrance of the main chapel, The muffled sounds of high society expectations drifted through the heavy mahogany wood. A string quartet was playing a flawless, sweeping rendition of a classical concerto. They were attempting to weave a romantic, elegant spell over a room that was actually suffocating under the weight of imminent financial ruin and massive, fragile egos. Through the thick doors, I could hear the low rolling hum of the Atlanta elite. Politicians, corporate executives, and country club socialites were settling into the velvet cushioned pews. They were completely oblivious to the fact that the billionaire defense contractors they were so desperate to impress were currently sweating through their custom suits with frozen bank accounts. They were sitting in an air-conditioned bubble of extreme privilege, waiting for a bride who had built her entire identity on a mountain of lies. They were waiting to celebrate a union funded by a bouncing credit card, orchestrated by a patriarch who had extorted his own daughter to maintain his fake social standing. The sheer absurdity of it all was almost poetic. The catering trucks were likely still idling at the loading dock, preparing to drive away with the evening dinner service, while the guests inside happily flipped through expensive gold-embossed programs. I stopped exactly 2 feet from the towering mahogany double doors. The brass handles were polished to a mirror shine reflecting the bright afternoon sun and the blinding crisp white of my service dress uniform. I stood in the heavy silence just outside the sanctuary, letting the gravity of the moment settle over my entire body. For my entire life, standing outside closed doors in this family meant waiting for permission to enter. It meant making myself small, checking my posture to ensure I did not look too intimidating, and biting my tongue so I would not upset the delicate balance of my mother's aesthetics. It meant swallowing my pride and hiding my light so Chloe could shine without any competition. I thought about my father's final text message. I thought about Hunter Sterling smirking at me in the bridal suite, calling me a diversity hire who pushed papers in a basement. I thought about the years of being told I was a failure, a disappointment, and just a government paycheck living off taxpayer dollars. They had spent decades trying to convince me that I was entirely worthless without their wealth and their social validation. But as I took a deep, steadying breath, expanding my chest against the rigid fabric of my tunic, the lies simply evaporated. I felt the unmistakable solid weight of the gold oak leaves resting securely on my shoulders. I felt the sharp grounding pin of the Navy Cross resting directly over my heart. I did not need permission to enter any room on this planet. I had earned my place through blood, through grueling deployments, and through absolute, unshakable integrity. I had carried broken men out of collapsed extraction zones. I had audited billion-dollar defense networks and dismantled corrupt supply chains. I had forged my identity in environments that would make Preston and Hunter Sterling weep in terror. My uniform was not a costume worn to ruin a wedding aesthetic. It was a testament to my survival. It was the physical manifestation of every single obstacle I had crushed and every expectation I had shattered. I was not bringing aggressive masculine energy into Chloe's pristine fairy tale. I was bringing the unvarnished, undeniable truth. I reached out and wrapped my hands firmly around the cool, heavy brass handles of the chapel doors. I did not push them open hesitantly. I did not slip through a narrow crack in the wood to minimize my presence, or slide into the back row unnoticed. I engaged my shoulders, braced my stance, and shoved both heavy mahogany doors wide open in one simultaneous, powerful motion. The heavy wood swung outward with a massive echoing boom that immediately drowned out the delicate plucking of the string quartet. The heavy hinges groaned in protest as the doors hit the interior stoppers. The bright, blinding natural light of the afternoon sun flooded directly into the dimly lit, candlelit sanctuary, casting my shadow long and sharp straight down the center of the plush, white carpeted aisle. The music skidded to an abrupt, screeching halt as the cellist lost her place in sheer surprise. The low hum of elite networking vanished instantly, replaced by a collective, breathless gasp that rippled through the hundreds of seated guests. The doors were open. The stage was set. I lifted my chin, locked my eyes straight ahead, and prepared to walk into the absolute center of the storm. I stepped over the polished brass threshold, and let the heavy mahogany doors settle open behind me. The thick, pristine white carpet of the center aisle immediately absorbed the sharp click of my shoes, but I did not need auditory footsteps to announce my arrival. The blinding Georgia sunlight poured into the dim, candlelit sanctuary through the open doorway, wrapping around my crisp service dress white uniform and casting a long, commanding shadow straight down the aisle. The contrast was absolute. I was a pillar of stark, undeniable reality, cutting straight through a room built entirely on expensive, fragile illusions. The high society guests seated in the back pews were the first to notice the disruption. I watched the subtle ripple of movement as heads began to turn. The rustling of imported silk, the shifting of tailored suits, and the soft clinking of pearl necklaces filled the air as the Atlanta elite craned their necks to see what was interrupting the carefully curated ambiance. They expected to see a late-arriving dignitary, or perhaps a confused member of the venue staff. Instead, they saw a black woman standing tall and rigid, in full military dress, the gold oak leaves gleaming on her collar, and the bronze navy cross resting heavily over her heart. The polite ambient whispering that had been hovering over the pews instantly began to falter, replaced by a wave of confused, breathless murmurs. Far down at the front of the chapel, my father finally realized what was happening. Deacon Harrison stood near the altar, his hands clasped nervously in front of him, as he desperately tried to project an image of calm control. He looked past the sea of seated guests and locked eyes with me. Even from 100 feet away, I could see the visceral shock hit his system. The blood entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the warm amber glow of the chandeliers. His jaw tightened so fiercely I thought his teeth might shatter. He had explicitly forbidden me from wearing this uniform. He had threatened to disown me, erase me, and banish me to the kitchen to protect his fragile social standing. Yet here I was, claiming the absolute center of the room. I watched his hand twitch. He was preparing to signal the ushers. He was getting ready to dispatch the private security guards he had likely hired to quietly intercept me and drag me out the side door before I could ruin Chloe's aesthetic. He took a sharp breath, his mouth opening to issue a quiet, frantic command to the men standing near the altar. But my father never got the chance to issue that order. He never got the chance to exert his fake authority because the true authority in that room had already recognized me. Standing in a rigid, impenetrable wall across the back of the chapel were the 67 Navy Special Warfare operators Preston Sterling had flown in as his personal public relations props. They had been standing at parade rest, completely ignoring the whispering socialites and the desperate networking attempts of the defense contractors. They were waiting in the shadows, bored and entirely unimpressed by the superficial display of wealth surrounding them. The towering Master Chief, the same man who had coldly ignored Hunter Sterling's arrogant business card pitch in the foyer, was positioned closest to the center aisle. He shifted his gaze as the sunlight flooded the room. His cold, battle-hardened eyes swept over my uniform, taking in the precise alignment of my ribbons, the gold on my collar, and the Navy Cross on my chest. Recognition hit him like a lightning strike. He did not see a discarded daughter or a diversity hire. He saw the tactical commander who had pulled his men out of a completely collapsed extraction zone 2 years ago. He saw Admiral. The Master Chief did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He did not care about the delicate string quartet playing their romantic concerto. He did not care about the wealthy politicians seated in the front row or the fragile nerves of the bride standing near the altar. He cared only about absolute, unwavering respect for the chain of command. He squared his massive shoulders, pulling his chest up and expanding his lungs to their maximum capacity. He locked his eyes dead ahead, his posture stiffening into a pillar of pure lethal discipline. Then he opened his mouth and unleashed a command that tore through the quiet elegance of the chapel with the force of a detonating explosive. Admiral on deck. His voice was a deafening, gravelly roar that physically shook the massive stained glass windows lining the walls. The sheer volume and intensity of the call shattered the delicate manufactured peace of the sanctuary. It was not a polite announcement. It was a military directive demanding immediate, absolute compliance from every single soul in his unit. The response from the operators was instantaneous and devastatingly powerful. All 67 Navy SEALs moved as a single, terrifyingly synchronized organism. They snapped from parade rest to the position of rigid attention. The sound of 67 pairs of heavy combat boots slamming their heels together hit the polished marble floor with a cracking, thunderous boom that sounded exactly like a synchronized gunshot. The physical shockwave of that movement rolled through the chapel, vibrating up through the wooden pews and rattling the crystal glasses resting on the side tables. Before the echo of their boots could even begin to fade, every single operator raised their right hand in a sharp, blindingly fast motion, executing a flawless knife-edge salute. They held it there perfectly still, their eyes locked straight ahead, rendering maximum military honors to the woman walking down the aisle. The string quartet, completely startled by the sudden roaring command and the explosive crack of the boots, panicked. The cellist jerked her bow, letting out a horrible screeching dissonance before dropping her hands entirely. The violinists froze their instruments, hovering uselessly in the air. The music died a sudden, brutal death. The entire chapel plunged into a heavy, suffocating dead silence. The wealthy, whispering crowd was entirely paralyzed. The elite socialites, the politicians, and the country club regulars sat frozen in their pews, their eyes wide with genuine terror and utter confusion. They had paid for a polite, elegant afternoon of high society networking. Instead, they were trapped in the middle of a stunning display of absolute lethal loyalty. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. They simply stared at the wall of saluting operators and then slowly turned their heads to look at me. Up at the altar, the facade of the Harrison and Sterling dynasties was vaporizing in real time. Hunter Sterling stood frozen near the front pew, his mouth hanging slightly open. The smug, arrogant smirk he had worn in the bridal suite was entirely gone. He stared at the saluting men, the very operators he had just tried to buy with free hotel rooms, and then he looked at me. The horrifying realization was visibly washing over his face. The woman he had called a diversity hire, the woman he had told to stay out of the way, was the exact commanding officer these elite warriors answered to. Beside him, Preston Sterling looked like he was going into cardiac arrest. His frozen bank accounts and the sudden terrifying display of military authority were colliding in his brain. He was a defense contractor who made his living navigating military bureaucracy. He knew exactly what it meant when a room full of Tier 1 operators snapped to salute a senior officer. He was finally doing the math, realizing that the woman walking down the aisle was highly likely connected to the sudden devastating freeze on his corporate assets. Chloe was standing on the altar steps, clutching her custom bouquet so tightly her knuckles were white. Her perfect, highly curated aesthetic was completely hijacked. This was supposed to be the moment everyone stood in awe of her beauty and her wealthy new family. Instead, the entire room was holding its breath in sheer reverence for the sister she had tried to hide in the kitchen. The panic in her eyes was raw and absolute. And then there was my father. Deacon Harrison was trapped. He was completely outflanked and utterly powerless. The billionaire defense contractors he worshipped were currently cowering in fear, and the military men he had used as marketing props were actively rendering honors to the daughter he had just threatened to disown. His ultimatum had backfired with catastrophic, humiliating precision. I did not rush. I took my time, keeping my posture perfectly rigid as I returned the salute with a crisp, fluid motion. I lowered my hand and continued walking slowly down the center aisle, my shoes clicking steadily through the dead, silent room. I was the storm they had foolishly invited inside, and I was going to make sure they felt the rain. I stopped precisely halfway down the pristine white aisle. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the terrifying weight of unyielding military discipline. I snapped my right hand up, executing a flawless, razor-sharp salute to the men who had bled for me. The Master Chief held my gaze, his eyes communicating a profound, unspoken loyalty that no amount of country club wealth could ever purchase. I dropped my hand sharply to my side. In perfect, thunderous unison, all 67 operators dropped their salutes, their arms snapping down with a loud, synchronized crack that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Hunter Sterling could not process what was happening. His fragile inherited ego was completely short-circuiting. The reality that his expensive rented military props were submitting to a black woman he had repeatedly degraded was simply too much for his entitled brain to handle. His face flushed a furious, ugly crimson. He stepped away from my terrified father, marching aggressively down the center aisle right toward the Master Chief. He moved with the reckless, unearned confidence of a man who had never been punched in the mouth for being disrespectful. "What are you doing?" Hunter demanded, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and absolute bewilderment. His shouting shattered the reverent silence of the chapel, making several guests flinch in their pews. "Why are you saluting her? I am the one paying for your hotel suites. I am the one buying your drinks tonight. She is nobody. She is just a diversity hire pushing papers in a basement." The Master Chief did not even blink. He slowly turned his head, looking down at Hunter Sterling, with a gaze so intensely lethal it could have frozen boiling water. The sheer size and combat-hardened presence of the operator made Hunter look like a petulant, misbehaving toddler throwing a tantrum in a sandbox. The Master Chief took one single deliberate step forward, invading Hunter's personal space and forcing the arrogant billionaire heir to stumble backward. Pushing papers, the Master Chief repeated, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried effortlessly across the silent sanctuary. "You have absolutely no idea who you are talking to, little boy. This is Commander Washington." The name hung in the air, striking my family like a physical blow. The Master Chief gestured sharply toward me, his voice rising with absolute, unquestionable reverence. "She is the tactical commander who pulled my entire platoon out of a completely collapsed fire zone in Yemen. When the air support failed and the extraction coordinates were compromised, she held the line. She carried my brothers on her back while taking hostile fire. We did not fly to Atlanta for your free drinks. We did not come to this pathetic circus to be your corporate marketing props. We only came to this charade because we heard she was going to be here and we would follow her straight into hell." The impact of the Master Chief's words was catastrophic. A collective gasp swept through the wealthy congregation. The elite socialites who had spent the weekend whispering about my supposed failures were now staring at me in sheer, unadulterated awe. Up at the altar, my mother let out a small, horrified whimper, covering her mouth with her hands. Chloe was shaking violently, her custom bridal gown trembling around her, as the reality of my actual life completely obliterated her fake, curated narrative. My father looked as if he was going to vomit. He had spent my entire life trying to convince me I was a failure, and now the most dangerous men on the planet were publicly declaring their absolute devotion to my leadership. But the most devastating reaction did not come from my family. It came from Preston Sterling. The patriarch of the defense contracting empire stepped out from the shadows of the altar, his eyes wide and locked onto my chest. He was not looking at the Navy Cross anymore. He was staring directly at the intricate, highly specific combat ribbons and the command insignia pinned to my collar. His face went ghostly pale, the arrogant tan entirely draining from his skin until he looked like a walking corpse. Preston was a man who made his living navigating the ruthless bureaucracy of the Pentagon. He knew military structure better than he knew his own children. He knew exactly what those specific gold oak leaves meant when paired with that specific logistical command insignia. His eyes darted from my uniform up to my face, reading the polished nameplate he had entirely ignored at the country club brunch. The final horrifying puzzle piece clicked into place inside his mind. He finally recognized my full name and my official title. I was not just a commander. I was not just a tactical officer who had seen combat. I was the head of the Naval Special Warfare Acquisitions Board. I was the supreme operational auditor for the Defense Logistics Agency. I was the exact singular person who held the absolute fate of his desperate billion-dollar Sterling Dynamics defense contract right in the palm of my hands. I watched the terror actively consume him. The realization hit Preston Sterling with the force of a runaway train. The frozen bank accounts, the declined credit cards, the sudden, inexplicable hard freeze on all of his corporate assets. It was not a banking error. It was me. I had initiated the federal audit. I had flagged his company for gross mismanagement, safety violations, and fraudulent billing. He had spent the last 2 days at country club brunches and rehearsal dinners, openly mocking the very woman who served as his judge, jury, and financial executioner. Preston gasped, his voice a hollow, rattling wheeze. His knees actually buckled, forcing him to grab the edge of the polished wooden pew to keep from collapsing onto the carpet. You are the lead auditor. You are Washington. I took a slow, measured step forward, closing the distance between us. The chapel was dead silent, every single guest hanging onto my every movement. That is correct, Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice ringing out with crystal clear, devastating authority. I am the diversity hire you were laughing about in the sunroom this morning. I am the woman you said should be kept in the back office pouring coffee. I smiled, a cold, ruthless expression that offered absolutely no mercy. I submitted my final recommendation to the Department of Defense Oversight Committee just hours before I boarded my flight to Atlanta. Your company is currently under federal investigation for defrauding the United States military. Your assets are frozen, your billion-dollar contract is officially terminated, and your company is done. Preston Sterling let out a pathetic, suffocated noise, clutching his chest as his entire empire turned to dust in front of the Atlanta elite. Hunter stood paralyzed, looking between his father and me, his arrogant brain finally comprehending that he had just insulted his way into federal bankruptcy. They had demanded I sit by the kitchen doors to avoid embarrassing them, but I had just served them the absolute destruction of their legacy, and I did not even need to raise my voice to do it. The crushing reality of the moment slammed into Preston Sterling with the kinetic force of a collapsing building. A few hours ago, he was a titan of industry holding court in a sunlit dining room, boasting about his untouchable influence in Washington. Now he was a hollow, terrified shell of a man drowning in his own bespoke suit. I watched his chest heave as he struggled to draw oxygen into his lungs. He let go of the wooden pew, his legs trembling so violently that he nearly tripped over his own expensive leather shoes. He did not care about the hundreds of high society guests watching him. He did not care about preserving his dignity or his flawless country club aesthetic. Preston shoved past his own paralyzed son, practically stumbling down the pristine, white-carpeted aisle toward me. His hands were outstretched, palms up, the universal gesture of a desperate man begging for a lifeline. Sweat poured down his forehead, stinging his eyes and ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. Commander Washington Preston gasped, his voice cracking horribly as he closed the distance between us. Maya, please. This is all a massive, terrible misunderstanding. The logistics reports the supply chain discrepancies. I can explain everything. We can fix this right now. You do not need to involve the Federal Oversight Committee. We can bring you in as a senior consultant. We can compensate you handsomely for your tactical expertise. Name your price. Just make the phone call and lift the freeze on my accounts. He was openly attempting to bribe a federal auditor in a chapel filled with witnesses. It was a spectacular display of wealthy delusion. He actually believed his checkbook could buy his way out of a federal indictment. I did not move a single muscle. I stood anchored to the marble floor, letting his desperate, pathetic pleas wash over me like a light breeze. I looked down at his outstretched, trembling hands, and then I looked him dead in the eyes. I gave him nothing. No anger, no sympathy, no negotiation. Just the cold, blank stare of a military commander watching an enemy combatant surrender on the battlefield. Hunter finally snapped out of his shock. He marched down the aisle after his father, his face flushed with panicked indignation. Dad, what are you doing? Hunter demanded, grabbing his father by the shoulder. Stop begging her. She is just trying to intimidate us. Call the lawyers. We will bury her in litigation before she even makes it back to her base. Preston whipped around and slapped his son's hand away with a vicious, terrified backhand. Shut your mouth! Preston roared, his voice echoing violently off the stained glass windows. You absolute fool! She is the Acquisitions Board. She has the entire Department of Defense backing her audit. Our lawyers cannot save us from a federal freeze, you arrogant idiot. We are ruined. Hunter recoiled as if he had been physically struck, the last remaining shreds of his inflated ego turning to dust. The Sterling men were actively imploding in the center aisle, tearing each other apart as the realization of their complete financial annihilation took hold. Up at the altar, another realization was taking place. Deacon Harrison had been watching the entire exchange with wide, calculating eyes. His brain was working at lightning speed, processing the violent inversion of the power dynamic happening right in front of him. For months, my father had kissed the ground the Sterlings walked on. He had sold out his own blood to secure a merger with a billionaire defense contractor. But now that billionaire was openly weeping and begging for mercy at the feet of the daughter he had just banished to the kitchen. My father was a master manipulator, an opportunist who survived by latching onto whichever entity held the most power in the room. And in that chapel, under the heavy gaze of 67 saluting Navy SEALs and a crowd of terrified Atlanta elites, the absolute, undeniable power belonged entirely to me. I watched the pivot happen in real time. It was enough to make my stomach turn. Deacon Harrison instantly discarded the Sterlings. He abandoned the ruined billionaires, he abandoned the humiliated bride crying at the altar, and he bounded down the carpeted stairs with a massive, blinding, predatory smile plastered across his face. He smoothed his silk tie through his chest out and marched down the aisle toward me, as if the vile, hateful ultimatum he had delivered in the courtroom had never occurred. He completely ignored the sweating, begging form of Preston Sterling. He bypassed Hunter without a single glance. He walked right up to my side, his eyes shining with a frantic, greedy light. Before I could step back, my father reached out and threw his heavy arm around my shoulders. He gripped my pristine white uniform tightly, attempting to physically tether himself to my authority. He turned to face the stunned congregation, the politicians, the judges, and the silent, imposing wall of special operators at the back of the hall. He beamed at the crowd, projecting the booming, charismatic voice of a proud patriarch. "That is my daughter!" My father shouted, his voice ringing with fake absolute triumph. He squeezed my shoulder desperately, trying to project a unified front. I knew she had a surprise for us today. Look at her, a commander in the United States Navy, the head of the acquisitions board. I raised her to be a leader. I taught her everything she knows about discipline and power. I always knew she was destined for greatness. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his words was breathtaking. Less than an hour ago, he had called me a disgrace. He had called me a meaningless government paycheck. He had told me I was nothing, threatening to erase me from the family unless I took out a loan to fund his fake lifestyle. Now, seeing that I commanded the respect of the deadliest men on earth and held the power to destroy billionaires, he was actively trying to steal my glory. He was trying to rewrite history right there in the center aisle. He wanted the Atlanta elite to believe that my military success was actually his parenting success. He wanted to absorb my status, my rank, and my power, twisting it to save his own burning reputation. He stood there, grinning, his arm heavy on my shoulder, waiting for me to play along and validate his sickening narcissistic delusion in front of the entire city. I did not flinch. I did not pull away violently or raise my voice. I simply turned my head and looked at the heavy, desperate arm my father had thrown over my shoulder. The sheer weight of his hypocrisy was palpable, a physical manifestation of his lifelong need to siphon value from my achievements while actively attempting to crush my spirit. He was holding on to me like a drowning man clutching a life raft, completely oblivious to the fact that he was the one who had intentionally drilled holes in the hull. I reached up with my left hand. I did not swat his arm away. I grasped his wrist with a slow, deliberate pressure, my fingers locking around his expensive silk cuff. I carefully lifted his arm off my shoulder and let it drop uselessly to his side. The movement was entirely controlled, surgically precise, and utterly devoid of affection. "Do not ever attempt to touch my uniform again," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying enough lethal command to freeze the blood in his veins. My father's massive fake smile shattered instantly. The charismatic, booming patriarch he had been playing for the crowd evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, hollow shell of a man who suddenly realized he was entirely exposed. The high society guests seated in the front pews watched the interaction with morbid fascination. They saw the golden facade of the Harrison family dynasty crack and disintegrate right in front of the altar. I turned my back on my father, completely dismissing him from my operational focus. He was no longer a threat. He was simply a casualty of his own collateral damage. I locked my eyes back onto Preston Sterling. The billionaire defense contractor was still sweating profusely in the center aisle, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. He looked as if he was about to drop to his knees and beg for mercy. His son Hunter stood paralyzed beside him, the arrogant frat boy entirely replaced by a panicked heir who finally understood that his massive inheritance was currently being incinerated by the federal government. Mr. Sterling. I began, my voice ringing out with crystal clear, absolute authority that echoed off the vaulted ceiling of the chapel. As the head of the Naval Special Warfare Acquisitions Board, it is my sole responsibility to ensure that the United States military partners with contractors who uphold the absolute highest standards of financial integrity and operational readiness. Preston opened his mouth, likely to spout another desperate, pathetic bribe, but I raised my hand, cutting him off with a sharp, decisive gesture. I reviewed your comprehensive contract proposal personally this morning. I continued pacing slowly forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing barely 3 feet from the crumbling billionaire. I reviewed your logistics pipeline. I reviewed your supply chain protocols. And most importantly, I reviewed the heavily redacted financial statements your accounting firm desperately tried to bury deep within the appendices. The color completely drained from Preston's face. He knew exactly what I had found. The phantom subsidiaries, the inflated overhead, costs, the massive gaping holes in their liquidity that they had been desperately trying to patch with the impending billion-dollar government payout. Based on my audit, I stated, my words dropping like a heavy executioner's blade. Your company's financials are catastrophic. You are operating on fumes, Mr. Sterling. You are leveraging debt against non-existent assets to maintain an illusion of solvency. In fact, your liquid capital is so entirely depleted that you could not even afford to pay your own son's wedding catering bill today. A collective gasp swept through the sanctuary. The Atlanta elite, the politicians, and the country club socialites who had spent the entire morning fawning over the Sterling family's supposed infinite wealth were now staring at them in absolute, unadulterated horror. The secret was out. The emperors were completely naked. The whispers began immediately, a vicious, buzzing undercurrent of high society gossip as the reality of the bounced $50,000 check spread like wildfire through the pews. Preston Sterling let out a strangled, choked noise. Commander Washington, please. You have to understand the market fluctuations. We just need an extension. The capital is coming. I swear to you, the capital is coming. The only thing coming for you is a federal indictment, I replied, my voice completely devoid of mercy. When a defense contractor attempts to secure a billion-dollar government contract while actively concealing massive insolvency, it is not a market fluctuation. It is a calculated, intentional attempt to defraud the United States military. I paused, letting the devastating reality of my words sink into his panicked brain. Sterling Dynamics is officially under investigation for federal fraud, I announced, delivering the absolute crushing blow. The asset freeze initiated this morning is permanent pending the outcome of the Department of Defense tribunal. Your logistics contract is denied, your security clearance is revoked, you are entirely finished, Hunter Sterling finally snapped. The arrogant, entitled heir could not handle the complete annihilation of his empire. He lunged forward, his face contorted in an ugly mask of pure, desperate rage. You cannot do this to us! Hunter screamed, raising his hand as if he were actually foolish enough to strike a commanding officer. He never even made it within striking distance. The Master Chief, who had been standing like a coiled spring at the back of the chapel, moved with blinding, terrifying speed. He crossed the aisle in 3 massive strides, stepping directly between Hunter and myself. He did not draw a weapon. He did not need to. The Master Chief simply planted a massive calloused hand flat against the center of Hunter's chest and shoved. The force of the shove sent Hunter flying backward. He stumbled violently, his polished shoes slipping on the marble floor before crashing hard into the wooden edge of a guest pew. He crumpled to the carpet, gasping for air, looking up at the towering, combat-hardened operator with sheer, unadulterated terror. If you take one more step toward the Admiral, the Master Chief growled, his voice a low, lethal rumble that carried the promise of absolute destruction. You will not have to worry about a federal indictment because I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your life eating through a straw. Do you understand me? Hunter scrambled backward, nodding frantically, too terrified to even speak. Preston Sterling was hyperventilating, clutching his chest as he stared at the ruined, pathetic heap his son had become. The defense contractors had tried to use these men as props, and they were currently finding out exactly why they were the deadliest operators on the planet. I looked at the Master Chief and gave him a single acknowledging nod. He stepped back, resuming his position at my flank, an immovable wall of highly trained loyalty. The chapel was completely silent again. The high society guests were paralyzed, terrified to make a single sound. The Sterling men were destroyed. My family's grand illusion was shattered. I adjusted the cuffs of my pristine white tunic, the gold oak leaves gleaming in the dim light, and prepared to deliver my final address to the Harrison dynasty. The heavy silence following the Master Chief's threat was broken by a sudden piercing shriek from the altar. Chloe had finally processed the entire situation. The words federal fraud and bankrupt had finally penetrated her thick layer of bridal delusion. She was not staring at me in horror anymore. She was staring down at Hunter, who was still cowering on the marble floor holding his bruised chest. Her perfect custom-designed fairy tale was unraveling right before her eyes. The realization hit her that she was not marrying into a dynasty of unlimited wealth. She was marrying into massive, insurmountable federal debt. She was marrying a fraud who could not even afford the imported orchids currently wilting around her. Chloe hiked up the heavy silk skirts of her gown and stomped down the altar steps. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly greed. "You are broke!" she screamed, her voice echoing shrilly across the sanctuary. She threw her expensive hand-tied bouquet directly at Hunter's head. The white roses scattered pathetically across the carpet. "You lied to me. You sat there and let me plan $1 million life when your credit cards are bouncing at my own rehearsal. You are absolutely nothing." Hunter scrambled backward, holding his hands up defensively. "Chloe, baby, listen to me," he pleaded, his arrogant swagger entirely replaced by pathetic whining. "It is just a temporary freeze. We will get the money back. My dad can fix this. Your dad is going to federal prison." Chloe shrieked, her meticulously curated high society aesthetic completely destroyed. "I am not tying my name to a bankrupt criminal. The wedding is off. We are done." She ripped the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger and threw it at his chest. It bounced off his shoulder and rolled under a pew, lost in the shadows. Chloe collapsed into the front row, sobbing uncontrollably, but she was not crying over a lost love. She was mourning the loss of her black card and her pristine social media narrative. My father could not handle the collapse. He watched his ultimate business merger, his golden ticket into the upper echelons of Atlanta society, disintegrate into a screaming, humiliating spectacle. The reality that his empire was dead should have humbled him. Instead, it drove him into a state of absolute frantic denial. He turned away from his weeping materialistic daughter and locked his desperate, wild eyes onto me. "Maya, you have to fix this," my father demanded. He marched toward me, his hands twitching at his sides, though he was smart enough not to reach for me again. "You caused this panic. You can undo it. Get on your phone right now. Call the Pentagon. Call your commanding officer. Tell them you made a miscalculation on the audit. Tell them you are clearing the funds. You need to save this wedding before the guests leave." I stared at him, genuinely marveling at the sheer depth of his delusion. He actually believed that a federal investigation involving the Department of Defense and billions of taxpayer dollars could be waved away with a simple phone call just to save his country club reception. He was so thoroughly blinded by his own narcissism that he thought the entire United States military would bend to preserve his social standing. "You are going to fix this mess," he ordered, his voice cracking as he tried to summon his old pastoral authority. "You owe this family your loyalty. You will authorize a bailout, and you will do it right this second." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to absolutely dismantle him. I stood perfectly straight, letting the ambient light catch the gold on my uniform, and looked at the man who had spent 32 years trying to break my spirit. I looked at my father studying his sweating, panicked face, and I delivered the final fatal blow. "Failures do not belong here," I said, quoting the exact venomous text message he had sent me in the coat room just an hour ago. The words struck him like a physical execution. His jaw dropped. The last remaining spark of hope in his eyes was instantly extinguished. He realized with absolute certainty that I was entirely out of his reach. The scapegoat was gone. The compliant daughter was dead. He had dug his own grave, and I was simply refusing to throw him a rope. I turned my back on him. I turned my back on the sobbing bride, the bankrupt billionaires crawling on the floor, and the suffocating toxic legacy of the Harrison family. I did not owe them another second of my time. I began my walk back down the center aisle. The Master Chief immediately fell into step just behind my right shoulder, matching my steady, authoritative pace. The high society guests shrank back into their pews as I passed, their eyes wide with reverence and terror. They were watching a true commander leave a battlefield she had just completely conquered without firing a single shot. As I approached the back of the chapel, the solid, intimidating wall of 67 Navy SEALs stood waiting. They were a formidable barrier of pristine white uniforms and combat decorations blocking the massive mahogany exit. I did not slow my stride. I did not break my gaze. The moment I drew near, the entire formation moved with breathtaking synchronized precision. The operators parted perfectly down the middle, stepping back in a flawless, fluid motion. They opened a wide, clear path for me, parting exactly like the Red Sea. I walked through the gap, feeling the immense, silent respect radiating from the men who knew my true worth. The instant I passed the threshold, the operators pivoted sharply and fell into step directly behind me. The deafening, synchronized crack of 68 pairs of polished boots echoed through the vaulted ceiling of the chapel, a thunderous march of absolute victory. They formed a massive, impenetrable honor guard, serving as my personal escort out of the toxic wasteland I had called home. I walked out the heavy double doors and stepped into the blinding, beautiful Georgia sunlight. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind us with a massive, echoing thud, sealing the Harrison and Sterling families inside their own ruined, bankrupt tomb. I left behind a canceled wedding, a crumbled fake empire, and a lifetime of manipulation. I walked toward the waiting transport vehicles, surrounded by the men who had bled beside me, the men who actually knew the meaning of honor. I breathed in the warm afternoon air, expanding my lungs against the crisp fabric of my uniform. For the first time in my entire life, I was completely, undeniably free. The most profound lesson from Maya's journey is that you can never heal by staying in the exact same environment that broke you. For years, she tried to earn a seat at a table built on illusions, gaslighting, and conditional love. The turning point wasn't just exposing the fraudsters, it was recognizing her own undeniable worth. True power doesn't come from forcing toxic people to respect you. It comes from having the absolute courage to pack your bags and walk away. When you stop shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's broken narrative, you finally give yourself the freedom to command your own life. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic table to protect your peace, drop A in the comments and hit subscribe for more empowering stories.